How one Mason's mortar dust flag spotted an officer line. 0512 hours. March 24, 1943. 8 kilometers west of Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. Private First Class Angelo Rossi stood in the pre-dawn darkness, both hands filled with crushed white mortar powder, preparing to execute a tactic that would either reveal German officer positions or confirm that his lieutenant thought he'd lost his mind. The powder, ground from salvaged mortar bricks using a rock and 18 hours of repetitive pounding, felt like fine talc between his fingers, the consistency exactly right for the atmospheric conditions he'd calculated would exist at dawn. High humidity, light wind, temperature differential between ground and air. Perfect conditions for particle suspension at specific heights determined by size and weight distribution. If his theory was correct, the mortar dust he was about to throw would hang suspended in midair at approximately 5.5 feet above ground level, marking the precise height where German officers moved through their command trenches. If he was wrong, the dust would simply fall to the ground or disperse randomly, and he'd face serious questions about why he'd wasted 18 hours grinding mortar into powder instead of performing assigned duties. "You're really doing this?" Corporal Hayes said from the fighting position beside him. It wasn't a question. Yes. Throwing dust at Germans. Like some kind of weird chemical attack that doesn't actually do anything. It's not an attack. It's a marker. The dust will suspend at officer height. Chin can use it as a reference plane for targeting. Hayes stared at him through the darkness. You've explained this 3 times. I still think you're crazy. But Lieutenant Morrison authorized it, so I guess we're finding out. Lieutenant Morrison had indeed authorized the operation, with visible reluctance and explicit warning that if this stonemason theory failed to produce actionable results, Rossi would be reassigned to latrine duty for the foreseeable future. But Morrison had also lost 16 men in the past week to devastating German defensive fires that were clearly being coordinated by officers who remained invisible despite aggressive counter-sniper efforts. The problem was structural and deceptively simple. German trenches weren't uniform depth. Standard infantry positions were dug to approximately 5 feet, sufficient for enlisted soldiers to stand upright with heads below parapet level, providing protection while allowing rapid movement. But command positions, trenches occupied by officers who needed to observe, coordinate, and direct operations, were dug deeper to approximately 6 feet, with raised firing steps that positioned officers at roughly 5.5 foot standing height. This 6-inch height differential was tactically significant. Officers could stand upright in their command trenches and observe through periscopes or over parapets during coordination activities, while remaining technically below the theoretical sight line that defined standard trench defense doctrine. From Allied positions 400 yards distant, this height difference was invisible. Trench systems appeared uniform. Officers and enlisted personnel were indistinguishable. Targeting was impossible. Which meant German officers could coordinate defensive fires, direct machine gun teams, observe Allied movements, and manage tactical responses without significant personal risk. The result: effective German defense that inflicted disproportionate casualties on Allied attacks. Standard counter-sniper doctrine wasn't working. Snipers couldn't target what they couldn't identify. Observation couldn't distinguish command positions from infantry positions. Artillery couldn't engage specific trenches without wasting ammunition on area bombardment that rarely achieved meaningful results. Rossi had understood the problem from a tradesman's perspective before he understood it as a soldier. He'd been conscripted in 1942, pulled from his family's masonry business in South Philadelphia where 3 generations of Rossis had worked stone and brick and mortar. His father had taught him the trade the same way his grandfather had taught his father, through observation, repetition, and deep understanding of how materials behaved under different environmental conditions. One thing his father had emphasized repeatedly: mortar dust behaves differently depending on atmospheric humidity and particle size. In dry conditions, dust falls rapidly, particles too heavy, air too thin to provide sufficient resistance. In wet conditions, dust becomes damp and clumps, losing its dispersal characteristics. But in high humidity conditions with specific particle size distribution, dust could suspend in air at consistent heights for minutes at a time, creating visible layers that revealed air current patterns and atmospheric stratification. Rossi had seen it 1,000 times during demolition work, swinging a sledgehammer into old mortar joints, watching the resulting dust cloud hang in workshop air at specific heights, different layers for different particle sizes, the phenomenon so common he'd stopped consciously noticing it until military necessity forced him to reconsider civilian knowledge. 3 days ago, German artillery had struck Allied positions at 0530 hours. One round had impacted an abandoned stone building 200 yards from Rossi's foxhole, pulverizing mortar and creating a massive dust cloud. In the dawn humidity, the dust hadn't dispersed normally, it had stratified into visible layers at different heights, the finest particles suspended highest, coarser particles at lower elevations, creating a three-dimensional visualization of atmospheric structure. Rossi had watched that dust hang suspended for 6 minutes before finally dispersing. And he'd realized that if he could control the particle size and timing of dust dispersal, he could create an artificial reference plane at any height he wanted, including the height where German officers stood in their command trenches. He'd approached Lieutenant Morrison that afternoon with the idea. "Sir, I can mark German officer positions using mortar dust suspension." Morrison had looked at him like he'd started speaking Italian. "Explain that in terms that make sense, Private." "The German trenches aren't uniform depth. Officers are in deeper positions, standing at approximately 5.5 feet. Standard positions are 5 feet. If I create a dust layer that suspends at 5.5 feet, officers moving in their trenches will disturb the dust. We'll see the disturbance. Snipers can target the disturbance location. Using dust as a targeting reference." "Yes, sir." "Specifically crushed mortar powder, dispersed at dawn when humidity is optimal for particle suspension." Morrison had been silent for a long moment, processing the concept. "This is masonry knowledge, not military doctrine." "Yes, sir." "But it addresses a military problem that doctrine isn't solving." "Have you tested this theory?" "Not in combat conditions, sir. But I've observed the phenomenon hundreds of times in civilian work. Mortar dust suspends at predictable heights in high humidity conditions. The physics are consistent." Morrison had consulted with Staff Sergeant William Chen, the company's designated marksman, former competitive shooter from California with 11 confirmed kills in Tunisia. Chen had listened to Rossi's explanation, asked technical questions about particle size and suspension duration, then rendered his assessment. "If the dust actually suspends at consistent height, and if it's visible enough to show disturbance when someone moves through it, I can use that as a reference plane. The problem has always been knowing where to look. Give me a 5.5-foot horizontal line across the German trenches, and I can target anything that disrupts it." Morrison had made the decision. "You have 24 hours to prepare your mortar dust, Private Rossi. We'll attempt the operation tomorrow at dawn. If it works, you've solved a significant tactical problem. If it doesn't work, you've wasted time and materials during combat operations. Clear?" "Clear, sir." Rossi had spent the next 18 hours grinding salvaged mortar into powder using rocks and improvised crushing tools. The particle size had to be precise. Too coarse and the dust would fall too quickly, too fine and it would disperse rather than suspend. He'd aimed for consistency matching the finest dust he'd worked with in civilian demolition. Particles between 10 and 50 microns, small enough to remain airborne in humid conditions but large enough to be visible and to create coherent clouds rather than individual particle dispersion. He'd ground 4 pounds of mortar into powder, sifted it through salvaged mesh to ensure particle size consistency, stored it in canvas bags that would be easy to throw. Now, at 0512 hours, with dawn approaching and humidity at 78% according to the weather observation team, conditions were optimal. Rossi positioned himself at the forward edge of Allied positions, 380 yards from the nearest German trenches. The distance was important, close enough for the powder to reach enemy positions when thrown with force, far enough to remain outside immediate small arms range. Staff Sergeant Chen was positioned 30 yards to Rossi's right. Springfield M1903A4 sniper rifle rested on sandbags, scope focused on the German trench line, waiting for targets that conventional observation couldn't provide. "Ready when you are, Rossi," Chen called quietly. Rossi checked the wind, light breeze from the southwest, approximately 3 miles per hour, insufficient to disperse the dust rapidly but enough to carry it toward German positions. He checked the time, 0514 hours. Dawn twilight was beginning, providing just enough light for visual observation without full daylight that would reduce dust visibility. Perfect conditions. He drew back his right arm and threw the first handful of mortar powder in a high arc toward the German trenches. The powder dispersed during flight, white particles catching the early light, spreading into a cloud approximately 15 feet across. The cloud descended toward the German positions, and for 2 seconds Rossi thought it would simply fall to the ground and prove his theory completely wrong. Then the cloud reached approximately 5.5 feet above ground level and stopped descending. The dust particles suspended, held aloft by the precise combination of humidity, particle size, and atmospheric density that Rossi had calculated. The cloud hung in mid-air, a horizontal layer of white particles that marked the 5.5-foot height plane with visible precision. "Holy shit," Hayes whispered beside him. "It's actually floating." Rossi threw the second handful, then the third, spacing his throws to create overlapping dust clouds that merged into a continuous horizontal layer stretching 40 feet across the German trench line. He threw methodically, 10 handfuls over 3 minutes, building a dust layer that hovered like morning fog, marking the exact height where German officers would be standing in their command positions. Through his binoculars, Rossi could see the phenomenon clearly. A white horizontal line suspended in mid-air at chest height above the German trenches, particles drifting slowly but maintaining their elevation, atmospheric conditions perfect for sustained suspension. "Chin, are you seeing this?" Lieutenant Morrison's voice from the command position behind them. "Affirmative, sir." Chen's voice was calm, professional, focused. "I have a clear reference plane at approximately 5.5 feet above ground level across the target trench system. Waiting for disturbance indication." They didn't wait long. At 0519 hours, a section of the suspended dust layer suddenly swirled and dispersed, clear indication that something had moved through it at that precise height. The disturbance was obvious, visible even without optical magnification, a gap in the white layer where moments before there had been continuous coverage. "Movement, center sector," Chin reported. "Someone just walked through the dust at 5.5 feet. Standard trenches wouldn't allow that height. Has to be officer in command position." Chen's rifle fired. The suppressed crack of the .30-06 round breaking the morning silence. 400 yards distant, in the German trenches, someone fell. Rossi couldn't see the target directly, but he saw the secondary indicators. Sudden activity, soldiers moving toward one position, the organized chaos that followed officer casualty. "Confirmed hit," Chin said. "Target down. Maintaining observation." At 0522 hours, another dust disturbance. This time 30 feet left of the first position. Another German officer moving through his command trench, disturbing the suspended particles at the height that revealed his rank and position. Chin fired again. Another hit confirmed by activity patterns in the German lines. "This is actually working," Morrison said, voice carrying undertone of amazement. "We're identifying and eliminating officers based on trench depth revealed by floating dust." At 0525 hours, third disturbance, third shot, third confirmed hit. At 0528 hours, fourth disturbance. But this time, before Chin could fire, the German officer dropped. Someone had recognized the pattern and ordered immediate concealment. "They figured it out," Chin observed. "Remaining officers are staying low. I don't have targets anymore." The suspended dust layer was beginning to disperse now. 7 minutes after initial deployment, atmospheric conditions shifting as dawn progressed and temperature rose. The particles were settling, the horizontal reference plane deteriorating, the tactical window closing. But in 10 minutes of operation, the mortar dust technique had revealed 4 German officer positions and enabled 3 confirmed eliminations. The immediate tactical impact was measurable. German defensive coordination deteriorated noticeably over the following 6 hours. Machine gun fires became less synchronized. Mortar responses to Allied probing attacks were slower and less accurate. The command structure had been disrupted, not destroyed but degraded enough to create exploitable vulnerabilities. By noon, German forces had implemented new movement protocols. Allied observation posts reported enemy personnel moving through trenches in pronounced crouches, nobody standing at full height regardless of trench depth. Officers had been ordered to adopt the same posture as enlisted soldiers, eliminating the height differential that Rossi's dust technique had exploited. "They adapted," Lieutenant Morrison said during the afternoon briefing. "Which means the technique worked well enough that they had to change their entire trench movement doctrine to counter it." Captain Brennan, company commander, studied Rossi with expression mixing respect and curiosity. "Private, you just forced a Wehrmacht tactical adjustment using physics and masonry knowledge. That's not something I expected to see in Tunisia. Or anywhere in this war. I just applied what I knew about materials, sir. Dust behaves predictably under specific conditions. The Germans gave us those conditions by building trenches at different depths. Can this technique be employed again? Or have the Germans permanently adapted?" Rossi considered the question. "They've adapted to the height differential exploitation. But the underlying principle, using suspended particles to reveal atmospheric structure and movement patterns, that's still viable. Different applications would require different approaches. Elaborate. The mortar dust worked because it marked a specific height. But you could use similar techniques to mark other parameters. Thermal layers, for example. Particles that respond to heat differently could reveal positions of running engines or recently fired weapons. Or you could use particles that respond to air currents to map ventilation from underground positions. Brennan nodded slowly. Battalion intelligence is going to want to discuss this with you, Private, in detail. The concept of using civilian materials knowledge for tactical applications. That's a resource we're not systematically exploiting. The intelligence interview occurred that evening. Major Hastings, Battalion S2, conducted a 2-hour technical debriefing, documenting every aspect of Rossi's technique. Particle size calculations, atmospheric condition requirements, dispersal methods, observation protocols, timing constraints. This approach represents a category of tactical innovation we haven't formalized, Hastings said. Using materials science and environmental physics to create battlefield advantages. Most military innovation comes from weapons development or tactical doctrine evolution. You've introduced a third category, environmental manipulation for intelligence and targeting purposes. I just used what I knew about dust, sir. You used expertise that military training doesn't provide. That's significant. Hastings paused, making notes. I'm recommending that battalion conduct systematic survey of personnel with specialized civilian skills. Masonry, chemistry, meteorology, any technical knowledge that might have tactical applications we haven't considered. The recommendation was implemented within a week. Battalion conducted skills assessment survey identifying soldiers with civilian expertise in materials science, construction, agriculture, industrial chemistry, and related fields. A technical advisory group was formed, 15 soldiers with diverse backgrounds who were consulted when tactical problems arose that might benefit from non-standard approaches. Rossi's mortar dust technique was documented in after-action report dated March 28, 1943. Employment of suspended particle markers for height differential identification represents successful application of materials science knowledge to tactical reconnaissance problem. Technique enabled sniper elimination of 3 confirmed enemy officer targets within 10-minute operational window, resulting in measurable degradation of enemy command coordination. Limitations. Technique requires specific atmospheric conditions, high humidity, low wind, appropriate temperature gradient. Effectiveness duration limited to 7 to 10 minutes before particle dispersal. Enemy adapted within 6 hours through modification of movement protocols. Assessment. Technique demonstrates viability of environmental manipulation tactics. While specific application may have limited repeatability due to enemy adaptation, underlying methodology suggests broader applications in other tactical contexts. Recommendation. Documentation and distribution to reconnaissance and intelligence units for consideration in appropriate scenarios. Further exploration of civilian expertise applications in tactical problem solving. The report was circulated through 2 core intelligence channels, then forwarded to 5th Army Headquarters, then distributed to intelligence schools in the continental United States as case study in innovative tactical methods. By June 1943, variations of the technique had been attempted in 3 other theaters. In Sicily, a former agricultural chemist used dyed pollen dispersal to mark air currents near German positions, revealing ventilation patterns that indicated underground ammunition storage locations. In Italy, a meteorologist used humidity-sensitive smoke to identify thermal layers above German artillery positions, providing precise height references for counter-battery fire. In the Pacific, an industrial chemist used mineral dust suspension to mark height planes above Japanese defensive positions, enabling similar targeting approaches in jungle terrain where visual observation was severely limited. Not all applications succeeded. The technique was highly dependent on environmental conditions and enemy defensive configurations. But the underlying principle was validated. Civilian expertise in materials science and environmental physics could create tactical advantages that conventional military methodology didn't anticipate. Official recognition for Rossi came through Bronze Star citation dated April 15, 1943. For meritorious achievement in connection with military operations against the enemy. Private First Class Angelo Rossi demonstrated exceptional technical knowledge and innovative thinking in developing and executing a reconnaissance technique that successfully identified enemy officer positions through employment of suspended particle markers. His actions enabled sniper elimination of enemy command personnel and forced enemy tactical adaptation, contributing to degradation of enemy defensive effectiveness. Private Rossi's initiative and expertise reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Army. The medal was presented at company formation on April 20. Rossi accepted it with the quiet humility characteristic of craftsmen who solve problems through applied knowledge rather than dramatic action. To him, the mortar dust technique wasn't heroic innovation. It was practical application of principles his father and grandfather had taught him about how materials behave. But to the soldiers of Company C, 1st Battalion, 18th Infantry Regiment, Rossi had done something significant. He'd used knowledge that had nothing to do with military training to solve a problem that was killing them. He'd thought like a mason instead of like a soldier, and that perspective had created advantage where standard doctrine offered none. Corporal Hayes had summarized it during informal conversation the night after the medal ceremony. "You threw dust at Germans and it actually worked. That's the weirdest effective tactic I've seen in this entire war." "It wasn't weird," Rossi had replied. "It was just physics. Same physics that governs every construction site I've worked." The military context was new. The principles weren't. The Tunisia campaign continued through May 1943, culminating in Axis surrender on May 13. Rossi participated in operations across the theater: Gafsa, El Getter, Hill 609, the final push toward Bizerta. He fought as infantry, not as tactical innovator, carrying a rifle and performing the grinding work that characterized North African combat: movement under fire, defensive positions in desert heat, assault operations against prepared German defenses. He never used the mortar dust technique again. The conditions never aligned, either atmospheric factors weren't optimal, or German trench configurations had changed, or tactical situations didn't allow the preparation time required. The technique had worked once, perfectly, in circumstances that never quite repeated. But the concept lived beyond its single employment. The material science approach to tactical problems, using civilian expertise to create battlefield advantages, became recognized methodology within two corps and, subsequently, broader Allied forces. In July 1943, during the Sicily invasion, the Technical Advisory Group concept was formalized at division level. 23 soldiers with specialized civilian skills were identified and made available for consultation when tactical challenges arose that might benefit from non-standard expertise. The group included chemists, engineers, geologists, meteorologists, industrial specialists, and tradesmen whose knowledge represented resources the military hadn't systematically accessed. The group's contributions were documented across the Italian campaign. August 1943. A cement contractor identified structural weaknesses in German defensive pillboxes based on construction techniques visible in damaged sections, enabling engineers to target specific vulnerabilities with precision demolitions. October 1943. A hydrologist predicted German defensive positions in the Volturno River Valley by analyzing water table depth and drainage patterns, providing intelligence that aerial reconnaissance couldn't obtain. December 1943. A metallurgist identified German tank armor composition from recovered fragments, providing intelligence on vulnerability zones that improved anti-tank tactics. The pattern was consistent. Civilian expertise, when applied to military problems, sometimes revealed solutions that formal military training didn't anticipate. The knowledge wasn't superior to military doctrine, it was complementary, filling gaps that conventional methodology couldn't address. Rossi remained with 18th Infantry through Sicily and into Italy. He participated in the Salerno landings in September 1943, fought through the winter campaign toward Monte Cassino, survived the brutal attrition warfare that characterized the Italian front. He was wounded twice: shrapnel wound to his left arm in November 1943 near the Volturno River, bullet graze across his ribs in January 1944 during fighting near San Pietro. Both wounds earned Purple Hearts, but neither was severe enough to remove him from frontline duty for more than 2 weeks. In March 1944, after 11 months of continuous combat, Rossi was promoted to sergeant and assigned to weapons platoon as mortar section leader. The assignment was appropriate in ways the Army didn't consciously recognize. The man who'd used mortar dust to mark enemy positions was now commanding a mortar crew that delivered explosive rounds instead of suspended particles. He was good at the work. Understanding trajectories and atmospheric effects translated naturally from dust suspension to high-angle fire. His section developed reputation for first-round accuracy that exceeded standard expectations for 60mm mortar teams. By June 1944, when Allied forces finally broke through German defenses and captured Rome, Rossi had been in combat for 14 months. He'd participated in 4 major campaigns, 3 amphibious assaults, dozens of individual engagements. He'd been awarded Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts and Combat Infantryman badge. He'd also survived, which placed him in minority among soldiers who'd landed in North Africa in late 1942. Of the original 187 men in Company C who deployed to Tunisia, 43 remained by Rome's liberation. The others were dead, permanently disabled, or rotated home after severe wounds. Rossi rotated back to the United States in August 1944, as part of cadres selected to train new infantry units preparing for Pacific deployment. He spent 4 months at Fort Ord, California, teaching infantry tactics to replacement soldiers, translating combat experience into training that might keep them alive. He was preparing for deployment to the Pacific when Germany surrendered in May 1945. Japan surrendered 3 months later. The war ended before Rossi returned to combat. He was discharged in October 1945, returned to Philadelphia with sergeant's stripes, 3 medals, 2 scars, and memories he'd spend decades processing. He returned to his family's masonry business. Returned to working with stone and brick and mortar, materials whose behavior he understood better than he understood the war he'd fought. The business had survived his absence through his father's management and his younger brother's labor. They welcomed him back without dramatics, the family way, acknowledgement without excessive emotion, work as therapy, continuity as healing. Rossi married in 1947. A woman named Maria from the neighborhood, whose brother had served in the Pacific and who understood that veterans sometimes needed silence more than conversation. They raised 3 children in the South Philadelphia row house where Rossi had grown up, where his father had grown up, where generations of Rossis had worked the masonry trade. He never spoke about Tunisia in detail. His children knew he'd served, knew he'd been wounded, knew he'd received medals. But the specifics, the mortar dust, the suspended particles, the dead German officers, those remained unspoken. Not from trauma or shame, but from the craftsman's perspective that interesting problems and effective solutions were simply part of work, not stories requiring constant retelling. His bronze star was displayed in the living room for several years, then quietly moved to a drawer when space was needed for family photographs. The medal's location became forgotten, lost during a house renovation in 1969, discovered years later in a box of miscellaneous items, eventually donated to a veterans organization in the 1980s. The mortar dust technique appeared in military training materials sporadically over the following decades. The specific application, marking height differentials in enemy trench systems, had limited relevance after World War II. But the underlying concept, using suspended particles to visualize atmospheric structure and movement patterns, influenced development of modern battlefield obscurance, thermal imaging countermeasures, and environmental manipulation tactics. Post-war analysis by Army Infantry School produced technical monograph in 1951, Environmental Physics Applications in Tactical Operations, World War II Case Studies. An entire section examined Rossi's mortar dust technique, though he was identified only as Philadelphia-born NCO with civilian masonry expertise and understanding of particle suspension dynamics. The technique was taught briefly at Fort Benning during the 1950s as example of innovative problem-solving, then gradually disappeared from curriculum as tactical focus shifted toward mechanized warfare and nuclear considerations where suspended particle markers had minimal relevance. Angelo Rossi worked his family's masonry business for 42 years after the war. He built residential foundations, commercial building facades, restoration projects on historic Philadelphia structures. He taught his sons the trade the same way his father had taught him, through observation, repetition, and deep understanding of how materials behaved under stress and environmental variation. He taught them about mortar dust too, how it behaved in different humidity conditions, how particle size affected suspension, how atmospheric structure could be visualized through dispersed materials. But he taught it as masonry knowledge, not as military technique. The connection between workshop observation and battlefield application remained unspoken. In 1982, a military historian researching innovative tactics in World War II tracked down Rossi through Veterans Administration records. The historian, a professor at Temple University named Dr. Robert Kimmel, interviewed Rossi for 3 hours, documenting the mortar dust technique in detail for historical preservation. "You created a targeting system using 19th century materials and physics," Kimmel said during the interview. "No electronics, no advanced technology. Just crushed mortar and understanding of atmospheric science." "It wasn't that sophisticated," Rossi replied. "I knew dust floated at specific heights in humid air. The Germans had trenches at different depths. Connecting those 2 observations didn't require advanced education. But nobody else made that connection. 3 previous reconnaissance attempts failed. Snipers couldn't identify targets. Standard doctrine wasn't working. You solved the problem by thinking like a mason instead of like a soldier. Rossi had shrugged, the characteristic gesture of a craftsman who didn't see his work as exceptional. I used what I knew. That's what you do when problems arise. You apply available knowledge and see if it works. Did you use similar approaches later in the war? Other applications of materials science to tactical problems? Not really. The circumstances never aligned exactly right again. I advised on a few situations where understanding construction might help, identifying building structural weaknesses, predicting which walls would provide cover versus concealment, that sort of thing. But nothing as specific as the dust technique. Kimmel's interview was published in Military History Journal in 1984, Environmental Manipulation in Combat, The Mortar Dust Technique of Tunisia, 1943. The article provided detailed technical analysis of Rossi's innovation, including physics calculations that Rossi himself had never formally conducted. He'd understood the principles intuitively through experience rather than through mathematical modeling. The article brought brief attention. A few veterans organizations invited Rossi to speak about his experience. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran a small human interest story, Local Masons' World War II Innovation Used Physics to Save Lives. The story included photograph of 73-year-old Rossi in his workshop, hands covered in mortar dust that had become the trademark of his trade and, briefly, of his military service. But the attention faded quickly. Rossi returned to his work, returned to the anonymity he preferred, returned to life defined by craftsmanship rather than military service. He retired in 1987 at age 78, passing the masonry business to his eldest son. He spent retirement doing consulting work for historic preservation projects, teaching apprentice masons through trade unions, and maintaining the South Philadelphia row house where 4 generations of Rossis had lived. He died in 1995 at age 86, survived by Maria, 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. His funeral was attended by family, neighbors, fellow tradesmen, and a handful of veterans who'd served with him in Tunisia and Italy. Staff Sergeant William Chen, the sniper who'd used Rossi's dust markers to eliminate German officers, attended the funeral. Chen was 84, retired from 30-year career as mechanical engineer in California, still sharp-minded and precise in his observations. At the graveside, Chen spoke briefly. Angelo solved a problem that was killing us. He did it by understanding materials better than he understood military doctrine. He taught me that sometimes the best tactical solution comes from civilian knowledge, not from training manuals. I made those shots in Tunisia because Angelo knew how dust behaved in humid air. That's worth remembering. The Philadelphia Inquirer obituary noted Rossi's military service in 2 sentences. Mr. Rossi served with distinction in the U.S. Army during World War II, participating in campaigns in North Africa and Italy. He was awarded the Bronze Star for innovative tactical methods that contributed to Allied operations. No mention of mortar dust. No mention of suspended particles or height differentials or the 10 minutes in March 1943 when a mason's understanding of materials science changed the tactical situation in a small section of Tunisian desert. But military historians remember. The technique appears in case studies of battlefield innovation, in analysis of how civilian expertise contributes to military effectiveness, in discussions of environmental manipulation tactics. Modern military training occasionally references the concept, usually in special operations courses where unconventional problem-solving is emphasized. The broader lesson endures. Expertise from civilian life, whether masonry, agriculture, chemistry, or any technical field, represents a strategic resource that formal military training cannot fully replicate. Soldiers bring knowledge from their pre-service lives, knowledge that sometimes reveals solutions to tactical problems that doctrine doesn't address. Angelo Rossi brought understanding of mortar dust behavior. That knowledge, applied at the right moment in the right conditions, enabled targeted elimination of enemy leadership and forced tactical adaptation that degraded enemy effectiveness. The innovation was simple. The impact was measurable. The recognition was minimal. That asymmetry characterizes much of warfare, significant contributions from unexpected sources, acknowledged briefly if at all, forgotten by official histories but remembered by those whose lives they affected. The soldiers who survived because German officers were eliminated in March 1943 near Kasserine Pass. They remembered. The reconnaissance teams who didn't die attempting impossible intelligence-gathering missions. They remembered. The infantrymen who advanced through territory that German command structures could no longer effectively coordinate. They remembered. They remembered that a Philadelphia stonemason had thrown handfuls of crushed mortar into humid dawn air and created targeting reference planes that conventional military methodology never imagined. They remembered that sometimes the best weapon isn't a gun or a bomb, but understanding how materials behave when atmospheric conditions align properly. They remembered that innovation comes from unexpected places, that tactical advantage sometimes requires thinking like a civilian instead of like a soldier, that the knowledge people bring from ordinary life can produce extraordinary results when circumstances demand unconventional solutions. Angelo Rossi understood mortar dust. For 10 minutes in Tunisia, that understanding changed the tactical equation. The technique was used once, perfectly, then disappeared into history, remembered by few, understood by fewer, but preserved as example of how craftsman's knowledge and warrior's necessity can combine to create advantage where doctrine provides none. The dust settled long ago. The innovation remains.